All right, everybody. What we're going to do now is we're going to move to our next panel. Our next panel is a discussion about practical tips for increasing patent allowance rates. Everybody's got their own little favorite tip here. So what I'd like to do is start with the conversation by, again, going around the horn to get everybody's first impression of this and what they want the audience to know as we start this conversation. But let me introduce from left to right on your stage. We have John Rogitz, who's the managing attorney for Rogitz and Associates. Next, we have Drew Hirschfeld, who is former acting deputy director and I was told the longest serving commissioner at the patent office, and he is now with Schwegman. And next to Drew is Robert Brush, and he's a partner at Kim and Stewart. And last but not least is Edward Labar, and he is a shareholder at Volpe Koning. So again, gentlemen, as you are answering the question, please feel free to fill in a little bit more about your background. I think maybe even your technical expertise and experience might become relevant in some of the strategies that you particularly prefer based on the cases that you're involved with. What I'd like to do is let's start with Drew, and I'm starting with Drew because this is a panel that I wanted to have, and it was already on the list. And Drew, you selected this panel. I want to be on this panel. Why? What do you want people to start focusing on?
So it's funny, Gene, I was gonna address that anyway, even if you didn't ask it, because I remember reaching out to Gene and saying, yeah, this is a panel I'd like to be on. So I started at the USPTO in 1994 as a patent examiner and held a variety of jobs. And I just feel like that experience at the office has given me a good insight to how attorneys interact with examiners, how examiners receive those interactions, and how helpful or not, quite frankly, those interactions can be. So I just thought I can use some of the experience that I've had at the USPTO to try to help people understand some thoughts about how to move forward to raise our allowance rates.
Great, thanks a lot. John, let's move to you. What intrigued you about this panel? Because I think you also asked to be on this panel specifically.
Yeah, so I mean, this is literally half of my job. I do prep and pros, and I was just joking before the panel that, you know, I tell people sometimes, and I mean this mostly in jest, but only half of my job is being right on the law and the facts, and the other half of my job is knowing the count system and how to use it to my advantage. And that's just the honest truth. And so I play these little tactical games, I guess, for lack of a better word, for how to get results for my clients.
Great, yeah. Thanks a lot. Robert, what do you want people to focus on in the first instance as we have this conversation today?
And yeah, so we have over the years, obviously, all different fee arrangements with our clients, and one of the fee arrangements that I got involved in was getting a flat fee up front for the application and a few office actions. And so we started thinking, well, you know, I need to get this done faster or it's going to kill me if I can't go with 4 or 5 office actions. It's going to cost me a lot of money. So how do I get more efficient at the process? How do I interview examiners and work with the examiners to get it done as fast as possible to help both me and my client? And so when I started focusing on that, I, over the years, tried to come up with different tools and different things to try to get things allowed. Not only allowed, but allowed in an efficient manner with less back and forth with the patent office, which is helpful for lots of things, right? Lots of less prosecution history estoppel and so forth. So,
yeah, great. And Ed, you were gracious to be. You say I'll talk on any of these panels because this is what I do. So what do you want folks to know about increasing their allowance?
Sure. Well, I think the first thing that comes to mind for me is that I want to know why I'm asking that question. So, you know, obviously we want our patents applications to get allowed, but am I asking the question about how to increase the allowance rate because I'm trying to design a portfolio, or am I asking it because I'm working on a specific patent application and somebody's asking me whether or not they should file an RCE or something like that? And I think depending on what the answer to that question is, the strategy you take might be different, and I'm sure we're going to get into a lot of detail about that.
Yeah, no, I think we will. And Drew, I'll come back to you. What is your primary? I mean, for me, I thought about PPH. You did not. Actually, none of you brought up PPH, which we'll talk about later, out in the hallway. But what tool do you think people should focus on or use?
So to me, this is a very easy question. And to me, it's all about interviewing. And I feel like I would be, and this is, I think, exactly what I said to Gene when we prepped, I said, I think I'd be remiss if I didn't mention interview practice. I can tell you, going back to my experience as an examiner, I still remember those really good interviews that I had with attorneys because they were thoughtful, they were well prepared, we worked together. And I can literally still remember substance, I can remember names of those. Likewise, I remember the other ones that were horrible, right, where just everything went off the rails, and then, probably 95% of them in the middle that I don't remember. But I think interview practice is absolutely critical, and I've been away from PTO for a year now so maybe my numbers are going to get a little bit outdated. But the numbers that I was sharing when I was at PTO were those that interview have about a 10% higher chance of allowance than those that don't interview. And I believe it's actually much higher than that because you're not interviewing the easy cases where you know you're going to get an allowance, you're interviewing those harder cases. And so to me, that's really important. But here's the kicker. Only about 40% of the cases are being interviewed. So think about that, right? I mean, it's less than half of the people are interviewing. And when you do interview, you have a 10% chance higher rate. So I think it's really important to interview, and I think it's important to come in with a strategy on your interview. In other words, it's great to have proposed claims and great to talk about claim language, but you can learn so much more, right? Examiners may or may not be, I get it, but they may be willing to say, okay, I think there's allowable subject matter that you don't have claimed, or I think if you go in X direction, or I interpret this limitation this way and I think you're interpreting it this other way. I think all of these things are valuable, and to get something John said, you may even hear from the examiner, hey, if you can file this amendment right away, that would be helpful for me, right? And they might be hinting at where they are in their account system or not, right? So anyway, I just feel like there's so much that can be learned in a positive interview that to me, that is the starting place for allowance rates.
So let's go through and we'll ask each of you guys, starting John, do you follow Drew's advice? How many cases do you interview? And if you don't interview, why not? And I'll ask all of you that same question.
I interview as many as possible, as long as the client authorizes it, even if it's a really simple call. So I'll give you an example. I call this my please, please, please give me a patent call. I will, let's say there's lots of 102s and it's just tough, and I'm pulling a lot of stuff out of the specification. What I'll do typically is take a lot of subject matter out of the specification. And I might even put different things in the different independent claims, and I'm going to put 10 new dependent claims in, and I'm going to be like, okay, if this examiner wants to go to final, he's going to have to do some work. He's going to have to do 12, 15 different searches. And then I'm going to call him. And even if the client doesn't want to pay for the interview, there's go ahead, do it, knock yourself out, but we're not going to pay for it. Even a simple voicemail or a simple call, and you're just like, hey, I know this is a crowded space. You don't want to say anything too harmful that might make its way into an interview summary, but you say, crowded space, I'm just trying to get something from my client. Call me if you have any ideas. If you want to move a dependent claim into an independent one, if you want to get more specific, pull something else out of the spec. And you'd be surprised how many times I get calls back, even just from voicemails, 3 months, 6 months later. And they're like, hey, you said this, and I just was wondering if you'd be open to a deal. And I'm like, yeah.
It must be the end of your quarter.
Yeah, and it's funny because a lot of times examiners will say like, oh, that's really, I'm glad to hear that. I'm glad to hear that you're open to working with me and to getting something. I'm like, well, isn't that obvious? But a lot of times they just need to hear it because I think they go up against a lot of other attorneys who are just difficult, and all they want to do is argue. So even just a really simple call like that, and then you get into the more drawn out calls if you want to, have them see your side or appreciate how the art's not the same. Those get a lot more fact specific, and it depends on the examiner. But even just really simple 30-second calls like that can be very helpful.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
No doubt. So Robert, what's your philosophy on interviewing cases?
So as John did, I interview as many as possible. As a matter of fact, I have 2 clients that require it for almost every office action, unless it's trivial, and at least 1 interview. And so it's usually the first office action. And, in the interview, if you ever see the interview summaries, they're very summary. And you could say a lot of things in that interview that don't make it to the record.
Right.
And it's really beneficial, and you can just get down to the nitty-gritty and talk to the examiner. This is what it is. This is why it's great. And none of that really makes it to the interview summary. It'll be like applicant talk to examiner and agree to further searchings necessary. And so you can.
And that summarizes 30 minutes.
Yeah, exactly. So you could say a lot, and it's a good tool to put a lot out there that maybe you wouldn't be comfortable in putting in a written response.
Yeah. I'm going to come back to you, Drew, because you're smiling on this. But Ed, your philosophy on interviews and what your clients like them or not?
Sure, I'd say it's all over the map. It to some extent depends on the budget, but like Robert said, I do have 1 client that requires them for basically every office action. I think it's very helpful. I think if I got to pick myself, I usually wait until maybe there's a little bit of an impasse happening, because very often you get an office action and it's like pretty clear what the path forward is, and at that point I don't know if it's necessarily ready. It's time yet to burn the client money on the interview, but when you start to get a little sticky, then maybe conversation would be helpful. And then I want to come back to something John was talking about, his please give me a patent interview. I want to be one philosophy I have is I definitely don't want to go into the interview asking the examiner which way it should go. And I don't think that's what John was saying, but like I try to come to the interview with a kind of a set of proposals, maybe in an order that I'm willing to accept, so that I can kind of guide the examiner through it.
Yeah.
And
it depends.
Before we move on, I just want to echo something Drew said. I was an examiner in the aughts, obviously not to the degree that Drew was, but what surprised me the most when I got into private practice was how much the attorneys who weren't examiners don't understand that the best way to approach the interview was like from a working together perspective. I think everybody up here gets that, but it's like sometimes it's like you're really not going to get a case allowed by arguing or getting combative. It's really more like let's both sit on the same side of the table and look at this together and figure out what we can agree on. So I guess that's a lot of different things, but those are my philosophy.
So well, Drew, you were smiling. So let's come back to you here. When you started smiling when Robert was saying, a lot can be said that doesn't go on the record, and I think I know why. But share your thoughts.
I've known Gene for a long time. I knew I should know better than smile on the panel, because it's like raising your hand. So
yeah,
I was.
Drew and I have been friends for a very, very long time.
I was smiling. I've seen. So I do expert witness work now, and I've seen a couple. I've only been doing this for about a year, and I've seen some interview summaries that make you shudder, right? Both from attorneys and examiners, and so I do agree that the vast majority of interviews are very summarized and short. But I was smiling only because I think there are the exceptions to the rule that you should be careful with. But I will say this, and I know you've got one former examiner here, and I'm sure more in the audience, but I can remember when I was an examiner, I can remember some interviews actually summarizing, doing the interview summary with the attorney who I just had an interview with. And I was always comfortable with that as long as it was fair, right? So if we talked about like A, B, and C, and they said, okay, let's do an interview summary and let's only mention, C a little bit, I might get skeptical. But if it, was a reasonable discussion, I thought it was great to actually sit down and do something that we both were happy with and comfortable with. Again, making sure that it was a fair interview summary. So that's also a technique that I think you can use to avoid the 1 in a million that might not be summarized the way you hope it's summarized.
Well, the way that you hope as former commissioner was summarized, or the way. So what's the difference? I mean, what between the way that the office would like it done and the way that the outside world would prefer it be done?
Oh, that's a good question. So when I said the way you wanted it, I was not answering as a USPTO employee. I was saying the you was the practitioner you. I don't think that's a hard question, Gene. I think from the office's perspective, and I certainly don't want to speak for the office, but to me, the right interview is the accurate interview, right? And it's just what was covered and summarized is what should be in the interview. I totally get it that from a practitioner's standpoint, you may or may not want everything that's said in the interview. I'm not saying I condone that and support that. I mean, to me, if you're going to have an interview, sure, you should be comfortable with whatever's being said is in the record. But I would say, I would keep it really simple and say from the office's standpoint, accurate is what they would be looking for.
Okay. So before we leave the interviews, John, I want to get to you, and I want to pick up what Ed was saying, because I agree. I don't think you were saying, like, because the examiners don't like when you talk to them and say, well, what do you think? Is there something here, or is what am I missing? But what I think you're trying to do is strike up a negotiation, right? Because you got to get them interested in knowing that you're willing to make a deal.
Yeah, and it also depends on the client. We work for some larger companies, and they're not necessarily as concerned with breadth as they are maybe other things, like getting the certain inventor a patent or just getting into the space or something. So obviously, you don't want to give up too much ground if you work for you just really need a super broad patent, or you work for a startup or something like that. But yeah, I typically already have the amendment drafted, and if it's all stuff coming from the spec, the examiner is going to say I need to do a new search anyway. So, I mean, it really is just an opening, for more negotiations down the line with that specific tactic. Now, I'm not saying it's the only interview tactic I use. There's a lot of other ones, but with that one specifically, yeah, you're just saying like, look, I'm trying on my end, and I'd like to. If you got anything on your end, let me know.
Right. And I think it probably helps you identify who's willing to make a deal on their end as well.
Right, and you can also tell that a little bit just from the rejections themselves. You can see who's blowing stuff out to just get their counts without really taking a principled approach or a thorough approach, and you can go, oh, this person might be more willing. Like I said, like you do put a lot of different limitations into the claims and make them work, and say you can work, or you can do this allowance and get more counts for less work.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so. Let's pivot away from the interviews. That can come up. If it comes up, that's great. But Robert, what is your tactic du jour at the moment?
And so the interview is great, and what you want is you want ammunition in the interview. So you have to think about it ahead of time. So when you're drafting the application, you start thinking, well, how many times have you got an application, which of course you didn't write, but you got it, and there's no claims allowed, and there's nothing in it, no detail, and you're like stuck, and you don't even know what to talk to the examiner about. And so when you start drafting the application, think to yourself, hey, what can I do to help? And so one of the things you could do is have some, if you have 3 and 20 for your claims, have some narrow dependent claims, or, I used to call it a picture claim, or something that has a better chance of getting allowed, and it may be not something that you're going to take if they allow it, but it gives you an opportunity when you talk to the examiner and say, hey, you allowed this claim, and maybe it's got a longer dependency claim, but you liked something about this claim. What if I just took that feature and put it in claim 1 and not all the intervening stuff? And maybe it'll be good, maybe it won't be, but it gave you that opportunity to talk to the examiner because you got an allowed claim. Allowed claims are helpful, not just in terms of taking them, but also just starting your argument with something. The second tool I like to use is the specification. What can you put in the specification? So, one of the things you could think about is you write the case, and the inventor's going to review it, and he's going to tell you what's wrong, and you talk to him beforehand. In the inventor interview, you read the disclosure, so now you wrote the case and he's going to review it. So sometimes I'll just put in the inventor portion of the paragraphs, I'll put in a question. Hey, any more details that you have here? Because the inventors have lots of knowledge and lots of cool things, and maybe they didn't talk about it in the initial vendor interview, and maybe they won't tell you if they just review it, they're only going to tell you what's wrong. They're not going to add much more to it. But if you ask them and say, hey, a little comment, and hey, is there any more you can add to this? They might give you a bunch more details that you can put in the specification. And as I was saying before, you know, when you want to do amendments from the specification, having those details later could be the difference between life and death of the application. And so it's really good to get a second go with the inventor and say, hey, anything else we can add here, especially with the inventive parts.
Yeah, yeah. So Ed, your thoughts on that? Start. I mean, and I guess we want to talk in this segment about, you know, the claiming as well, claiming language, and making sure that what you're filing is intended to actually get an allowance.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think Robert covered a lot of that pretty well. I would say to expand on that a little further, a lot of the stuff that I'm involved in. I'm sorry, I get a little feedback. I have to be careful of the, like 101 issues and things like that. So I think it's pretty important to, you know, as Robert was saying, draft a complete specification, and I'm always very careful to include technical advantages and things that can be used in those arguments later. As to drafting claims that are going to, you know, solicit the interest of the examiner, maybe as to one particular aspect or another, I wanted to bring up, and I'm going to look around the room to see who perks up, because maybe this will identify patent examiners and maybe identify how old people are, but I want to bring up the pencil rule. and I'm only saying it because recently I've started getting claims allowed with examiners where I'm talking to them about, you know, they're really just uncomfortable with how broad and short the claim is, because I tend to focus very specifically on the novel part, and it's like it's definitely allowable, but there's a discomfort with how dangerous that claim looks. So sometimes you can add some more things to it, and you know, and you still have your claim, but the examiner feels more comfortable with it at that point.
Yeah, yeah. So Drew, you were an examiner, and you oversaw all the examiners. I'm sure you've heard the pencil rule. And
absolutely.
So, maybe why don't you explain from the?
It's not in the MPEP.
No, I don't think so. No, but you could add Chapter 3100, and it could be examiners please allow novel claims, even if they're short.
Sure. So you're asking me to explain the pencil rule to stuff, the folklore of the pencil rule?
From the office's perspective, what is the examiner? I mean, I think we all know, but what is the examiner afraid of?
So for those of you that don't know, I will explain the pencil rule. It is just this long-standing joke or folklore, whatever you want to call it, that if a claim, in order for the office to allow a claim, it had to be, you know, longer than a pencil, right? And I've seen people come in, you know, jokingly with sharpened pencils that are this big, right? And so, but none of that, you know, existed, honestly. I mean, that was all just, I think, in jest. I've never seen anything like that legitimately. But I think examiners, and I'll speak from my own career, right? So I'm not trying to implicate anybody else. I think when you're, you know, when you take a job to be an examiner, you know, you want to do the right thing. You want to make the right decision in a case. And I think it takes a while to learn that allowance is proper and okay, right? And I don't mean that in any negative way. I just mean that when you're new in a job and you're starting to examine, and you know, you think, wow, I'm going to put this out there. It's going to have my name on it. It's going to be a patent. It's going to, you know, potentially, you know, be important to somebody. There could be litigation on that. That's a pretty heavy weighted thing. So I believe examiners, you know, rightfully so, are cautious, and probably, if I'm again speaking from my own career, maybe more cautious in the beginning when you're a little worried. Did I do the right search? Did I do everything I could? And then as you get the confidence in the job, you realize, okay, I'm comfortable allowing that. So I think that's behind the, you know, hey, if this seems broad to me, even if I think this is an allowable limitation, but there's just something about it that gives me a little bit of worry, there might be some of that play behind somebody's thought process.
Sure, and I'm going to go back to Ed, because when Drew started talking, you had a big smile on your face. So what goes through your mind when you hear that? I mean, we all kind of know that that's what's going on, but
Well, what I was smiling about when Drew was talking was that I was wondering, because I know Drew knows a lot of statistics. I was wondering if there are any statistics about newer versus more experienced examiners and how long they take. Because I anecdotal, just N of one, I definitely get more fight, but maybe not as good a fight from junior examiners, just because they're afraid to allow things. They don't know what's allowable yet. So.
they don't know where the line is.
But that's just me. I don't know.
So I actually feel badly giving this answer because I'm not at PTO now and I don't want to speak for PTO and I don't know exact stats and numbers on that. I do think that there has been in the past statistics showing that newer examiners allow at a lower rate than more senior examiners. Obviously, these are numbers that are across the board, so you're going to have variance in them. I think that my own personal view on this is there's at least two factors. I'm sure if we knocked heads together, we can probably come up with a whole bunch more. But I think what I said before, just being new and making sure that you've done the thorough job that you should, and not having that confidence yet plays in. But also remember, junior examiners have somebody else who's signing their work. Right, and so a junior examiner has to go to a primary examiner and show them that this is allowable. So that's two hurdles, right? When you're a primary, and again, I'll speak for myself. When I became a primary examiner, I loved interviews because I knew in my head I know what's allowable here. I thought it was the greatest thing when an attorney and I would sit down together and we'd talk about what was allowable from the search. What did the attorney want? What did I feel was allowable? Was there something that was beneficial? Because it was in my best interest as an examiner to allow the case for my own production reasons. The attorney, for reasons you've heard on this panel, wants to get the case allowed. To me, that was a total win-win. And again, as a primary, you're not saying I've got to go back and check that with anybody else. So I think there's a fair amount of reasons why junior examiners might have lower allowance rates. And those numbers, I don't give specific numbers, but that is just my recollection. I don't actually know if PTO keeps those numbers now or not.
Okay, so John, let's go to you. Any last thoughts on the pencil rule, junior examiners versus senior examiners?
Yeah, I agree anecdotally with that. As far as the pencil rule goes, again, this is another tactic I would say. There are some examiners, I've had them tell me, they are just uncomfortable with the length of the claim, and it doesn't matter what it says or doesn't say, what the novelty is, they're just uncomfortable with it. And so, believe it or not, and they'll take this, if you have a limitation, just put wherein, cut and paste, limitation. And they're fine with that. It's just restating the same thing, but the claim is longer and they're more comfortable with it. And so it gets allowed. And it's not principled, but if it gets a result for your client, the claim isn't perfect, but at least they have a patent.
Yeah. So Robert, I'll give you the final word on this, since this is what you brought up about drafting it properly, writing the claim so that it can be allowed. Any last thoughts?
No, I don't. Again, getting the ammunition for the examiner to help you. It allows you to broaden the claim. So you could start broad, and you can get the rejection. But if you have dependent claims or things that you even know in the spec, especially if you wrote it, and then say, I'm going to bring that up later, because I'm probably going to get rejected because after all, almost everything's rejected the first time. But if I put this in there now, it'll get rejected the first time anyway. And so let's just save it for later. Let's put it in a dependent claim, and then I'll have something I can pull up, even if it's not allowed. Because sometimes they don't look at the dependent claims, or maybe they just look at it that way. And then you can bring it up in the examiner interview and say, hey, what about this claim? And they say, oh, that's a new thought. So, give yourself some room to grow the claim in later on, instead of maybe putting it all in there in the front and still getting it rejected. Now you're stuck.
So let me ask you about your philosophy then of, and all of you, but Robert, we'll start with you. Waterfall claiming, which some examiners call fishing expeditions, where you start with a broad claim, nothing ridiculous, but something solidly broad, and then 2 depends on 1, 3 depends on 2, 4 depends on 3, and you go through that list. And I've talked to some examiners that don't mind that, and I've talked to some examiners that absolutely hate that. I don't know why they would hate it. I mean, because it kind of lets, if they're really interested in allowing, that would give you an opportunity to know where their cutoff point is. Because at some point, if we write the claim long enough, it's going to be you could literally patent a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, which happened, you know.
Right.
But it was Smucker's, and it was the Uncrustables, and it had all kinds of limitations to it. So, what's your philosophy on that kind of claiming structure, or what structure should people use?
Right. So I mean, I think it's a valid claiming structure. Now, I mean, the former examiners can speak on maybe it's just harder to search, or maybe there's a reason why they don't like it. But you know, with all the limitations, you know, eventually you maybe get one of those allowed, and your client's not going to take that claim. Right? It's going to be too narrow. Maybe it's too narrow, but it gives you a starting point, like we mentioned before. And also, you know, you have to, you know, at the end of the day, your client's going to review the claim, and you know, I know at least my clients, if the claim has to be filed a little broader, they're just not going to accept it. They're going to, hey, how come those limitations in this claim? It's just too narrow for me.
Right.
When I was at in-house, we had a rule. It was like we couldn't even pay an issue fee on something with 250 words in it in the broad claim.
Wow.
And so, you know.
So is that that would seem to me to be a company that's looking for a patent, not a portfolio.
Well, I mean, it was just, you know, they didn't want it. I mean, if it took a lot of words to say, I guess it was fine. It was exceptions to the rule.
Yeah.
But if it just became something that you nibbled and grew and grew and grew and grew and finally got allowed, you know, because, you know, on the fourth office action, sometimes you get a claim that's just way too long.
Right.
So, you know, I guess that goes to a different point about nibbling and how, you know, it'll take longer. But
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's interesting. So, all right, so let me look at the time. Okay, we're doing good in time, but I want to make sure. So, Ed, let's move over to you. And what is your tactic de jour to get allowances? So we've talked about claiming and drafting. We've talked about interviews. Is there something else that you use yourself, or a strategy, or?
Yeah, I have to say there's really no silver bullet. And all those things.
I know, that's why we're having this panel, because we're trying. This is almost like Alcoholics Anonymous, right? Where we all get around and say, you know, oh, here's our story, here's my, you know, and then you try and learn something, I guess, from everybody's failures.
Yeah, I mean, trying to think of recent things you can do. Well, I mean, so maybe we can take it in this direction. I think at the top I mentioned that it's important to ask yourself why you're asking this question about like increasing allowance rates. So we haven't actually talked about this from the the portfolio perspective. So, I mean, this isn't the magic bullet either, but you know, if you have access to these statistics, I said Drew knew about statistics, but I think we all have access to a lot of statistics these days. I certainly was just looking at some. I have a well-known widget that's an overlay to pair, where I can just flip a switch and see all kinds of statistics about examiners and things like that. But it's not, I don't think that's always so valuable in the context of a single application, but if you were going to file a number of patents in a specific area, you might want to analyze the statistics of different examiners in an art unit or across different art units, and then to the extent that it were possible and to the extent that you had the resources to dedicate to this, you might want to consider how to write your claims so that you could get it classified into a certain art unit maybe, or I'm not sure it's possible to steer to a specific examiner. Maybe you guys have some experience with that, but that's something I've been turning over in my mind lately from a more macro perspective instead of the micro perspective that we've been talking about.
So who wants to tackle that? Because that is an interesting question about whether we're talking about, because I think the way, Ed, you mentioned it during our pre-call, was, are we talking about trying to increase the allowance rate of a particular patent, or are we trying to increase the allowance of the family? And those strategies may be a little bit different, or at least you should think about what you're doing and why. So do any of you guys want to tackle that? Drew, you looking like you're...
I can address some of it.
Sure.
So I do think that your strategy, of course, depends on what your client needs, and there is a big difference between filing a single application in an area versus you're going to routinely file applications in that same area. What I wanted to address was statistics and the classification system, quite frankly. I mean, statistics, they're so easy to get caught up into, and I will tell you that I've done the same thing in my 1 year of private practice since I left the government. I found myself looking at these numbers, oh, this examiner's this and that, and I was like, wait a minute, I'm the one who's coaching people against this. And I'm not saying that statistics these examiner statistics are bad. You just have to know what you're looking at, right? So you cannot compare somebody in, say, the financial areas of business methods to somebody in, say, semiconductors, right? Because they're totally different. They've got different restraints in terms of the case law that's on them. And so there's differences in allowance rates, differences in almost everything they do for valid reasons. So as long as you keep that in mind, and I'll tell you, I get calls all the time from sometimes people in my firm, sometimes people in other firms who are saying, like, you know, what do I do? I've got this situation. This is a true story. Or somebody called me, he's like, this examiner seems like they're never going to allow this case. So I look at these stats, I'm comparing them, and they're terrible. And I looked at the same examiner stats and compared them in the art unit. I said, you actually have one of the most easiest to allow art units, examiners in that art unit. It's just you weren't comparing to the right people. So I think just be careful with the stats. All information is valuable. I don't want to tell you any information is not valuable, but be careful and don't overuse them. The classification system is another issue, and I've actually, Gene and I did a whole webinar on the USPTO's new classification system when I was there. It is really hard to game the USPTO's classification system. And what I mean by that, it's hard to change a few words and divert to a certain art unit. So what I've actually been telling people, and I've done other webinars just on this topic as well, is, in my opinion, again, this is also technology dependent. If you're, say, like in an artificial intelligence and you're worried about an overlap with, say, business methods, for example, in my opinion, one of the best things that you can do in drafting those claims is know the USPTO's classification system, which is right on the USPTO's website, where you can go see how the USPTO is using, what definitions the USPTO is using to classify applications. You can see the terminology that's used. You can see what's needed for the claim in order for it to be classified in either, say, AI or business methods. And knowing that is going to help you draft that claim similar to the definition, as long as that's what your invention is, right? I mean, you can't, make a business method AI, for example, if it's truly not. But if you're really, in that area where there could potentially be both, I think knowing that classification system and knowing what words are used, how they're used, what the requirements are for the USPTO's classification system is the best way to divert an application to the extent you can. I've had a lot of people say, if I change the title, or can I do that? Or I change the abstract of the invention, will it change? I don't really think that the title or the abstract have any meaning, if at all any meaning. But I think the best way is a classification system. Anyway, we can probably have a whole another hour on just the classification system.
Yeah, no, we can. But so can you maybe, it might be worthwhile to discuss briefly how things have recently changed, because it used to be that you could influence where it was going, and much easier. I still think you.
I can do the elevator speech,
and I can explain how some people are doing it still, I think. But what's going on now?
Yeah, so it used to be the most comprehensive claim. So it's a single data point, and it went to, you look at the most comprehensive claim, the case gets classified based on that claim. And it would be a single classification in the USPC, the US Patent Classification System, goes over to the SPE in the art unit, and the SPE says, okay, I remember Drew Hirschfeld does this kind of application, so he's the right person. That's the old system. The new system is much more automated. They create every examiner has a examiner profile based on the actual cases that they've done. So back, and I don't remember how many years it is, but the PTO creates a profile based on the cases that every examiner's done in the past. So if you've been in this class 90% of the time, and this one 80% of the time, and this one 2% of the time, that's all part of your profile. Then every application that comes in gets a profile also according to its technology of all the claims and even the specification, and those profiles get matched. So it's a lot harder to make one simple change and say, now I'm going to going to divert this, because now you're matching profile to profile, and then the USPTO will say, okay, now these 10 examiners are the 10 people who are qualified for this. Examiner number 3 is actually the one with the most need for cases on their docket for some reason, and you can send it to that examiner. So it lets the office balance work, but also gets a much more accurate matching of a case to the right examiner, and you don't have to go on the SPI's memory. And I use an example with like something with a wheel with a coating on it. And the SPI would have to remember who does the coatings. Well, now if somebody's done coatings on wheels, that's in their profile, it'll automatically get matched. That was just hopefully as short as I can.
Yeah, no. I think that's useful, so we all understand. But I've talked to some people doing some really low tech stuff. And I don't know whether, and I can't say that I know for sure that this works still, but what they would do is they would look at the language that is used by the office to describe the focus of the art unit, and then they would include that language in the specification. And it's so the lowest tech people told me that they would just copy and paste that and put that into the spec, which I think that's kind of, I mean, I don't know that that's going to work, but I think if you know how the office describes the art unit and you can use those words, like you got, like we.
So that's the sorry to interrupt you, Gene, but that is a very similar approach to knowing the classification system.
Right. Well, right.
So that's the same general approach.
It's the same, and I think it's more than knowing the classification system now, because you have to. Because it's automated, right? I mean, you're trying to make this AI-based, as I understand. Not you, but the patent office, right?
And they are, actually.
And they are. And so, and I do this just to cascade from it. I do these webinars on how do you communicate to how does the Chief IP Counsel, Chief Patent Counsel, in-house counsel communicate to their boss and to the CEO and the board what they need. And the one question answer we always get is, well, when you talk to the CFO, you have to talk about numbers and cost savings, and that's what. And when you talk to the CEO, you got to talk in different language. To apply that here, I think that if you want to stay out of certain art units and you want to get into other art units, you got to use the language of those art units. And as awful as it may seem, like, John White and I, we joke around all the time. Like, if you have an invention and somebody's making money on it and you actually admit that in the specification, good luck. Because now it's a business method, and so let me go around the horn. Ed, you were just smiling at that. So what brought the smile to your face?
Dangers of smiling. I really just thought it was funny that you were.
Yeah. But do you have experiences? I'm sure you do, right?
I don't, except from the perspective that I am very conscious of 101 issues a lot. I mean, actually, I have the luxury of doing a lot of work in electrical and wireless space where it's pretty concrete, but then, I also encounter a lot of software and things, and it's getting easier these days because we have a kind of a roadmap to getting things allowed under 101.
So I wonder whether, like, if the law was as it existed today, when wireless technology first started, it would have to be an abstract idea. Or under NUG 10, where it's like a signal, a non-continuous signal is something that doesn't exist. No, it exists. I mean, take the knife, walk over to the outlet, and stick the knife in the outlet, and you get an idea. Okay, well, that signal was there whether I saw it or not. I'm just now pulling it out, right? So we have some of these like real crazy rulings, and I wonder what that would have done to those kinds of technologies. And we just think about take it for granted, but I think those lessons can be very, very important. Drafting. I mean, I think so. I don't know. Am I just crazy?
No, I think so. Yeah.
Go ahead, Robert.
So before Alice, or way back, right? So we used to get business methods allowed. That's crazy, right? Shocking, right? And you do State Street, and you'd be like, oh, it's tangible, or oh, a computer did it, and the examiner would be like, right, computer did it. Good. Yeah. Even though there was Benson, right, in the 70s, computer did it wasn't enough, but somehow it became enough, because that's how like the pendulum was swinging. Even though when you're kind of thinking as an attorney, why is that enough? It doesn't make sense. There's case law that says it's not. But anyway, so that was enough, and so you got all these things allowed, and then. Of course, Alice happened, and I haven't got a single business method. I mean, it was to the point where you didn't even recommend your clients to ever drop the case. I mean, there's no chance.
Right, right. I mean, even the big company, Google, IBM, those companies die in the business method area. So what chance does a small startup have? John?
Yeah, well, I was just thinking, you know, this, all the talking about classifications and stuff like that. I mean, you are much more tempted to do the things Drew's talking about specifically in fintech because of the background of that case law. And, you know, we still have some clients who sort of file in that area, but I think this also goes back to what Drew was saying. Like, so the temptation is that don't say anything about money, you know, like you're saying, but you can get to the point where you're so far away from the invention in the terms of art that should be used, that are going to be used by the skilled artisan, that you're going to get a case like you were talking about in another panel, like, what am I even reading? What's the invention? Right. And so on a certain level, you can get so caught up in this stuff. The primary focus should be on claiming the invention, giving yourself places to go during prosecution, building a robust, fully enabled application. And then, like,
I wish the Federal Circuit were here to hear that.
Yeah,
because that's so important. I mean, right? If there's money in the claim at all, you die at the Federal Circuit. You die at a lot of places, but you certainly die there. So then you run into the, well, I'm not going to call it money. I'm going to call it data, and I'm moving data from here to there. But it's not that's not the invention. That's not what was really innovative.
Yeah, yeah. So you just have to take a chance sometimes. If the invention is about money or licensing, banking, something, you're just going to have to accept it. Look, if you want to spend the money, do it. If not, think about a trade secret, you know?
Yeah.
So I very much agree with what John is saying. You know, the invention is the invention, and when I was saying, you know, it's hard to game the system, you're not going to be able to say, if you truly have a business method invention, right, and you're not going to be able to get it to a different art unit by this game and have success. That's my view. The flip side to that is you want to be careful that if you have something like AI, you don't write it in a way that you end up in the business method art units because of the way you wrote it. And that's where I think the conversation about using the classification system and some of the other techniques are helpful. And again, true story, I got a call from an attorney saying, this is like, how did I end up in a business method? This is not a business method, and now what do I do? And I read the claims, and I went back and I was like, I read a business method here, right? And it's like, well, I wrote it broadly because I was trying to do this and I was trying to do that, and well, they gamed the system, so to speak, so much
going the wrong way
that it actually hurt them,
yeah.
right? And so you have to be careful of that. But I wholeheartedly, 100% agree. At the heart of what you're trying to do for your client is get their invention patented, and their invention is their invention, and you're not going to be able to just steer it to some other place in the office, you know, just because you want to use creative words. It's where you just don't want to make the mistake that I spoke about.
Right, right. No, absolutely. Okay, so I'm looking at the time. We have probably, I guess, about 10 minutes or so just to give you guys an idea. So the one thing that hasn't come up yet, but that we did talk about, was track one, which I think it's obvious, and maybe it's too obvious. Maybe we don't need to spend so much time on it. But successes with track one, anyone? Well, I can tell you, before I stopped representing clients, I advised all of them to go track one, because the allowance rate appears to be, like interviewing, an extra 10, maybe more % higher allowance rate across the board. And when it first started, it was much higher allowance rate. And I would tell my clients this, and they would say, okay, yeah, let's do that. That makes a lot of sense. And go through saving money because we're cutting down office actions, et cetera. And then when it came time to file, it was like, yeah, you know, let's not do that, because it isn't free. But for small entities, it's not ridiculously expensive. So have any of you had successes or failures or with track one? Robert?
I just have a failure convincing my clients to want to use it.
Yeah.
It just, they just don't want to.
So what's the hang up for your clients?
I think it's probably just financial.
Yeah.
It's so different from what they know, right? So it's scary.
Yeah. So Drew, what's your point of view?
I can tell you what I've heard. I'm also thinking that it would be great for somebody, and whether this is PTO or somebody on the outside, to evaluate the cost of the true cost of track one, because you do save back and forth with the examiners and you save, you know, what I heard was at least one response, right? So factoring in the cost of having to create that and more efficiency, maybe it's not as costly as people think it is. I'd like to see that analysis, because then maybe you can convince your client and say, look, this is really a huge benefit here to you. I can just tell you what I've heard over and over, both while I've been at the office and since I've not been at the office. I hear people similar to what you said, Gene, that they try to tell people, you should use this for every case, because it's just, first of all, there is a higher allowance rate, and again, I don't know if this number is exact, but somewhere around the 10% higher allowance rate, I believe. It's also like 6.5 months or so on average to final disposition, which is crazy fast. And I hear from people that it's just, I hear routinely they get better examination. And I kid you not, when I was at the office, I was asking, like trying to find out from people in the office, why do you know, are we doing something different here, right at the office? And people are like, nope, same thing here. And then I get outside, I'm trying to say, are you attorneys doing something different? And they're like, no, the office does something different. So I will sit here and tell you, I don't know why I get that feedback, that it's more efficient and more effective. I think people in the office think the attorneys are selecting certain cases and writing them differently. I think people on the outside think the office handles them differently. No idea what the answer is, but I do know that I routinely hear that these are the prosecution is efficient and effective, and you're able to move to allowance a lot faster than you can in other cases.
So I was, and I wrote, so this is a CLE hour, by the way, and one of the articles that makes up the materials, which all the materials are on the program website, and on the program pages are the materials, on the panel pages rather, are the materials. I wrote an update of track 1, and the reason why we can't say exactly what the increase is the office doesn't necessarily compare apples to apples in the data that they give you. There's like, okay, over this period of time, like fiscal 23, we've had this many allowances, this many final rejections, this many abandonments, but you don't know exactly when all those were filed, and some of them were filed before in fiscal 22, and some of them were filed in fiscal 23, and so if you assume it's kind of the same in a moving way, then it would be almost exactly 10% increase. But we can't say exactly what it is. But I wonder, as you were talking about the cost, Drew, the thing that came to my mind is why is the office charging what they charge? Because there would be savings on the office's side as well, for speed and so forth. And I remember when I didn't remember, I read it on IPWatchdog going back to when Terry Ray was acting director. I interviewed her. And there was thought that this may become like the model, the future model, the way the PTO handles these cases. And it seemed to me that the money was being charged so as to prevent everybody from wanting to do it. But now, you never even got to $10,000 a year. I don't think.
I'm going from memory. Bob's shaking his head no. Sorry, Bob. I think we did get, I think PTO did get right around the 10,000.
Oh, you do? Yeah. Okay. All right. So, but still, 15,000, you know, is out of 600,000. I mean, so somewhere there's, you know, like the guns and butter curve, you know, from Econ 101. There would seem to be a curve where the patent office recoups so enough, and it's low enough for us to convince people to no, you want to do that. You need to do this. I just don't know. I think it's a great. I think tool.
There's a lot of things to balance there. I think it's how many filings, it's union interactions at the PTO, quite frankly, and how many we think, you know, I say we, I'm not there anymore, but how many the PTO thinks that they can handle without making everything, if everything's expedited, nothing is. Right, so I think there's that balance, but I know that, you know, I don't profess to know what the right balance is, but I think all those factors weighed in.
Yeah. So that's why I always, you know, people complain that they can't get patents. I'm like, well, have you used track 1? And the answer is always no. And it's like, well, maybe you should do something different.
So I want to see a study of the cost, the true cost of track 1, and I want to see a study of the true cost of when you file a rote translation without actually fixing it before you get to PTO, because I think the costs, people are trying to save money up front, and I think they're probably doubling their costs.
Oh, no doubt.
Making that number up myself.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, because if the first office action you get from the examiner is 30 pages of 112 because your translation was crap and your claims translated in crap, you know, it's just a waste. you're throwing an office action away. You're guaranteeing at least one, probably 2 RCEs. But we're getting down to the end, and none of you brought up PPH. I like PPH. I think PPH is a great tool, and particularly because I always advise people anymore that what they should be doing is they should be filing PCT applications, because there's a lot more favorable jurisdictions around the world. Your international portfolio is becoming much more important. And then if you get a favorable search in the PCT process, that qualifies you to move to the front of the line for PPH in the U.S. And the allowance rate seems to be quite high, like extremely high, like almost 90% high. And that makes a lot of sense, right? Because the only way to qualify for the treatment is by claiming substantially the same thing that was either allowed in an Office of Earlier Action or which got a favorable search result in the PCT process. Anyone have thoughts on the PPH and why it may be? I think it's underutilized. Ed, you look like you got some thoughts.
Yeah, we use it. I was actually going to bring it up when we were having the track 1 discussion. I have to say we never use track 1, but it might be because the kind of prosecution I do comes from maybe a different. We're very often not trying to rush to allowance because we don't want to take allowance of claims that we don't have an idea are already infringed, basically. So maybe we want to build some delay into that process. But once we get to the point where we're ready to take allowance of a claim set, then we want that claim set everywhere. We want that in Europe and Japan and everywhere else. So that's from that perspective, like track 1 might not be of interest, but PPH definitely very useful.
Okay. Other thoughts, guys?
I think different than track 1, you can convince your clients to do PPH. It's just that they don't file. I mean, a lot of clients just really don't. They reserve just the most important cases for foreign filing because it's super expensive. So
yeah,
it's just a less opportunity. Where at track 1, you'd have a lot more opportunity because it could be used for any case, but they don't want to do that one. But PPH, they're more receptive to. It's just way less opportunity because it's only like the A-rated cases that even get foreign filed to begin with. Right.
John, any thoughts on that?
I agree with everything they've said. It's definitely very useful when you can do it. You can't always do it. I think it's, from an examiner's perspective, it's an easy allowance because someone else has already done the work. But I think, as we might have talked about during the pre-call, it also depends on where the first allowance came from, and what the reputation is of that search entity.
Right.
But yes, it's why not if you can.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So we're at the end, but I want to give you rapid fire, really rapid fire. If there's one thing that people remember from this, what do you hope that is? Ed, let's start with you.
Sure. I'm just going to come back to what I said at the beginning. I said when you're trying to decide how to increase allowance rates, you got to think about: are you looking at it from a macro scale or a micro scale? Are you just from the perspective of a single office action? Then maybe looking into things like statistics and stuff might not be as useful as your own professional judgment. But if you're trying to manage a big portfolio, maybe you have the resources to dedicate to more of the complicated gaming that we were talking about before, that you can divide over the cost of the whole portfolio or something like that.
Great. Thanks a lot, Ed. Robert, your final thought for today.
Examiner interviews. Just do your interviews, and then try to give yourself some ammunition for those interviews. Think about it ahead of time when you're drafting. What can I do for my exam interview that's going to be in 2 years? Yeah,
great. Good stuff. Drew, I think Robert just stole your final thought.
No, that's good. I'm glad we agree. I'll just say, big picture, I like the idea of the approach that you and the examiner are working together, and you deal with the exceptions if they arise, but the more you're teaming and working as one to try to get to an end, I think the better off you are.
Great, thanks a lot, Drew. And John, you'll have the final word on this panel.
Okay, so I gave you all I'm not going to argue. I'm going to throw a bunch of stuff in and hunt for allowable subject matter. The one last thought I'd like to leave everyone with is that a lot of times examiners won't pay attention until you appeal them. And so appeal it seems counterintuitive because you think the case is going to be in front of the board for 2 years before they even consider it. But if you have a really strong case, it might not go to the board. They're going to go to conference, and you might get a call for an allowance. And so an appeal is a really, really good tool for an allowance if it's a good case that you have. So think about
it. All good stuff, guys. Thank you so much. Thank you. Really appreciate it.
And thank you.